Hi everyone, thanks for joining me here on JKD Handmade. For this tutorial, I'll be showing you how to work up this raglan sweater using the Sedge Stitch. For the materials, I used a category 4 worsted weight yarn. This is a really soft yarn. I found that the yarn together with the stitch pattern gave me a really winter cozy warm sweater, which was exactly what I was looking for. You may also use a DK weight yarn for this pattern. I'd suggest that you stick to yarns that are really soft. You will also need hooks, 2 of them. For my ribbings, I used the recommended hook on the yarn label. In this case, it was a 5mm hook. So that was for all my ribbings. And then I went up 1 size larger on that recommended hook for the rest of the sweater. In my case, it was a 6mm hook. If you feel that your stitches are tight, you may go up 2 sizes on that recommended hook for the rest of your sweater. If you're using a DK weight yarn, you can use the recommended hook, which is a 4mm hook for all your ribbings, and then you can go up 1 or 2 sizes on that recommended hook for the rest of the sweater. You'll also need stitch markers, a pair of scissors, a yarn or wool needle, and a measuring tape. This is an easy pattern. The only confusing part to this pattern is when you get to round 1 of the body. That's when you're joining your front body to your back body and you're forming the armhole spaces for your sleeves. Now, you'll see that I do explain 2 methods for round 1 of the body. You will decide on which method you understand or which is easier for you. I personally prefer method 1, but that's all up to you. I suggest you watch the video and then you decide. When you get to round 1 of the body, it's really important that you are working in that direction of your stitch pattern. And you'll see that the stitch pattern is working your sedge stitches into the single crochets from the sedge stitch from the round before. And as we get into the pattern, I'll explain more, but that's just a heads up that it does get slightly confusing, but watch the video and then you decide from there which method you prefer or you understand. This tutorial is for all sizes. I will provide all those measurements in the tutorial as we get into this pattern. For those of you that are new to my channel, I share all sorts of tutorials. These are just patterns that I work up for myself, my family, and my friends and choose to share it with you. If you do enjoy my tutorials, please do consider subscribing. And to all of you that have already, a huge thank you. Let's get on with this tutorial. Form a slip knot. Chain 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Into the second chain from the hook, single crochet. Continue with single crochets into the remaining chains. You have 4 stitches, 1, 2, 3, and 4. At all times, make certain that your stitch count remains the same for the rest of the ribbing. Round 2, chain 1 and turn. Here we're working all our stitches into the back loops only. If you look at your stitch, it's made up of 2 loops. Here's the front loop, the loop that's closest to you, and then you have your back loop, the loop that is further away from you. We'll work all our stitches into these back loops. Your first stitch will be the one from where the chain 1 comes out of. Work single crochets into the back loops only. You have 4 stitches, 1, 2, 3, 4. So for the rest of the ribbing, you're repeating round 2. It's just chain 1, turn, single crochets into the back loops only. Continue on until you've worked a length for your ribbing. I've continued on with my ribbing. All I've done was repeat round 2. So here I have a length for my ribbing. At this point, I want to take this length of ribbing and measure it around the circumference of my head. These two ends must meet, and you, when measuring, measure this ribbing unstretched. Do not stretch on it when measuring. Just measure as it is. Once the ribbing fits the head circumference, we now need to count the number of rounds that we've worked, and these number of rounds must fit into this head circumference measurements ribbing and stitch count chart. So to count the number of rounds of ribbing, you'll see that here we have these raised edges here. So in between these raised edges, there's 2 rounds of ribbing. So if we look at it, here's an incomplete edge here. So that's 1, 2, and then here's a raised edge. Then that's 1 round and 2 round. Here's a raised edge and here's a raised edge. So that's 1 round and 2 round in between all these raised edges. So to count, it's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, and so on. Count the number of rounds and see that it fits into this sizing chart. Here's the ribbing and stitch count chart. This chart works with the stitch pattern. Now I actually, at first I worked 69 rounds, and here you see I've got 60 rounds and I've got 72. Always work to the rounds further away. So then I increased by 3 rounds to bring it to 72 rounds so that it fits into this chart. I will be using 72 rounds here, and I'll use these 3 digits for my separations. Once you've got your ribbing fitted and sized according to the chart, we'll go ahead and slip stitch these 2 ends to join. So it's a chain 1, and then you'll bring the opposite end together. Then you're getting into the stitch on one side and into the stitch on the opposite side, and you can pull through into the stitch on the one side, into the stitch on the opposite side, yarn over and pull through. For 4 stitches on your ribbing, you need to work 4 slip stitches to join. Now we'll continue on with the yoke. So you'll swap out your hook for the larger hook, and we'll work round 1 of the yoke. Here we're working single crochets all along this edge of the ribbing. You'll notice that there are no stitches to work into. We'll work all our stitches into the little gaps along this top edge of the ribbing. So for every round of ribbing, you will work 1 single crochet. Now I've already explained that there's 2 rounds in between these raised areas. So here's 1, 2. So in between all these raised areas, you need to work 2 stitches. Insert your hook into that little space, pull up a loop, yarn over, go through 2 loops on your hook. So you continue on with single crochets into all these little gaps along this edge of the ribbing. I've worked those single crochets all around this ribbing. Before joining to complete this round, you need to count the number of stitches you've worked and make certain that it's the same as the number of ribbing rounds. In my case, I worked 72 rounds for my ribbing, so I need to work 72 stitches. I've counted my stitches, it's 72 stitches. I can now slip stitch to join. Into that first stitch, slip stitch. We'll now separate this yoke into our sleeve, front body, sleeve, and the back body. For this, you'll need your chart. Now you'll see here's your ribbing rounds, and on this side we've got 3 digits. Those are your stitch count or separations. So here you'll count start as your first stitch. So that's 1, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16. So according to my size here, the first digit is 16, and I'll place my stitch marker into that 16th stitch. That will make up my second corner. And then moving on, it's 37 for my next one. So that was 16, 18, 20, 2, 4, 6, 8, 30, 2, 4, 6, and 37. And then I have 52. So that was 37, 38, 40, 2, 4, 6, 8, 50, 52. So those are the 3 corners that I've marked off. You will mark off your corners as per this chart. So if you've worked your ribbing to 60 rounds, you'll use those 3 digits for that round or whatever it may be. Start will make up my first corner, and then I have my corner 2 at stitch marker 1, corner 3 at stitch marker 2, and corner 4 at stitch marker 3. Every now and then I will cut into the video using my sample that you see here if I feel that something needs a little bit more explaining. So here, for any beginners out there or those of you who are new to working raglans, it's so important that we are able to distinguish our sleeve from our back body and our front body. Here's my start. This is the sleeve, front body, sleeve, and the back body. So I suggest that you place a stitch marker here at the sleeve on the one side and a stitch marker on your sleeve on the opposite side. That's on the inner side of the neckline. Now you'll see that as we go further on, we'll need to fold this yoke in half. Here it's super important to fold it at the sleeve and not at the back body and front body. So that's just a little tip for you. Round 2, chain 1 and turn. Into that same stitch from where chain 1 comes out of, we'll work a sedge stitch. Now To work a sedge stitch, we're working a single crochet, a half double crochet, and a double crochet all into one stitch. So we'll work a single crochet into that same stitch, then a half double crochet, so it's yarn over, insert your hook into that same stitch, pull up a loop with 3 loops on your hook, yarn over and go through all those loops, and then a double crochet, yarn over, insert your hook into the same stitch, pull up a loop, yarn over, go through 2 loops on your hook, yarn over, go through 2 loops on your hook. And you'll skip the next 2 stitches, so that's 1, 2, and into your next stitch you'll work a sedge stitch. That's your single crochet, half double crochet, and a double crochet, all into one stitch. Skip the next 2 stitches, 1, 2, a sedge stitch into that next stitch, continue on with skipping 2 stitches and your sedge stitch into the next stitch until you get to the first stitch marker. I'm at my first stitch marker. I have 2 stitches before that stitch marker. For my corners, I'll work a sedge stitch, I'll work a chain 2 and a sedge stitch all into that stitch marked off by the stitch marker. So I'll skip the next 2 stitches, work a sedge stitch, chain 2, 1, 2, and let me remove the stitch marker, and I'll work a sedge stitch into that same stitch. So here I have a sedge stitch, chain 2, sedge stitch all into that one stitch. I'll replace the stitch marker into that chain 2 space. For my yoke, I'll continue working my corners into this chain 2 space. Then you'll continue on working your sedge stitch pattern into every 3rd stitch. When you get to your corner, it's a sedge stitch, chain 2, sedge stitch into that allocated stitch. So I've got to work a corner here and a corner here, and in between it's my sedge stitches. I've worked my way to the end of round 2. I have 2 stitches remaining, 1, 2. Into that space, work a sedge stitch. So this is the same space from where our first sedge stitch comes out of. So that's a single crochet, a half double crochet, and a double crochet all into that same space. Then it's a chain 2, 1, 2, then slip stitch into the single crochet from start. So we've got a sedge stitch, chain 2, sedge stitch. At all the corners, you'll work it in this way. Always a sedge stitch, chain 2, sedge stitch. For our next rounds, for the yoke, we'll work them into the chain 2 spaces. Round 3, chain 1, turn, single crochet into that same chain space, half double crochet, double crochet. We've worked a sedge stitch into this chain 2 space, and then you'll continue on with your stitch pattern, working the sedge stitch into every 3rd stitch. So you're skipping 2 stitches and you're working your sedge stitch into the 3rd stitch. You'll skip 2 and work your sedge stitch. Notice for this round, we're working our sedge stitch pattern into the single crochet from the round before. So if you look at it, here's quite a tall stitch. That's your double crochet. Then it's your half double crochet, and here's your single crochet. Just as a guide to know that you're working your pattern correctly, it's always your sedge stitch into the single crochets from the round before. So here goes. I'll skip those 2 stitches into that single crochet. I'll work a sedge stitch. Then get into the single crochet from the round before, skipping the 2 stitches before that. And I'll work my sedge stitch. So you'll continue on with your stitch pattern to your stitch marker. I've worked my way to that first stitch marker. So once you get to your corners, this is the only time, especially for the first stitch at the corner. Like here, your corners are made up of 2 sedge stitches and in between a chain 2. I'm talking about this stitch right here. This is the only time that you will not work into that single crochet. Instead, you'll work your sedge stitch into the chain 2 space. So you skipped those stitches and you work a sedge stitch into the chain 2 space. Then it's a chain 2 and another sedge stitch into that same chain 2 space. Replace your stitch marker into that chain 2 space. Then you'll continue on skipping 2 stitches, working your sedge stitch into that single crochet from the round before until you get to your corners. At your corners, you'll work a sedge stitch, chain 2 sedge stitch into this chain 2 space. So you've got to work it here at the next corner, and then you'll get back to your end right here. I've worked my way to the end of round 3 right here. I've worked those sedge stitches in between for my sleeve, front body, back body, and sleeve. And here at the stitch markers, I worked my corners. So that was stitch marker 1, 2, and 3. Now I've got to work this corner right here. So to complete the round, I'll skip these stitches and into that same chain space from where I had started off my first sedge stitch, I'll work a sedge stitch. So that's a single crochet, half double crochet, and a double crochet. And then it's chain 2. Into that single crochet from our start, I'll slip stitch to join. So here we have a sedge stitch, chain 2 sedge stitch, and these will make up all our corners just for the yoke. So that's really the pattern for the yoke. You'll go on to work round 4 until the required length for your yoke. So then it's repeating round 3, it's chain 1, turn, single crochet into that chain space, and then it's a half double crochet and a double crochet, and then you'll continue on working your sedge stitches into all these single crochets from the round before. So thereby you'll skip 2 stitches in between, and then when you get to your corners, you'll work a sedge stitch, chain 2 sedge stitch into the chain 2 spaces. And then once you get back again, it's a sedge stitch into the same stitch from where we had started, and it's a chain 2 and a slip stitch to join. You'll repeat this round until you reach your required length for your yoke. I've continued on with my yoke just by repeating that stitch pattern. At this point, when I fold my yoke in half, Be certain to fold your yoke at the sleeves and not at the body. So make sure that it's folded here at the sleeves. Fold your yoke in half. Align edges well. Measure out the armhole depth for the size you are making. I am making a size medium, so that's 7.5 inches or 19 centimeters. I've worked a mini yoke. This is only a sample. So here you see I've worked a few rounds, and I'm going to assume that when I fold my yoke at the shoulders or at the sleeves and measure out my armhole depth for the size that I'm working, I'm going to assume that I've already done all of that. So once you've measured out your armhole depth, then you'll decide on how you're going to work round one of the body. Now, for working round one, there are two methods. I actually found it really difficult trying to explain both methods to you. So my preference was to tell you that you need to work your yoke until your last round of the yoke must be worked until when you're working round one of your body, you are able to work round one into the back body and not the sleeve. On this particular sample, I'm showing you the sleeve portion. Please ignore that. I need to explain to you what I mean. So once you've measured out your armhole depth, check to see that your next round will be worked when you turn for working your next round. So it's that sedge stitch into that chain 2 space. And then for your next round, to continue on with the stitch pattern, you know that you need to work it into the single crochets from your rounds before. So here, if I work it into the single crochets, make sure that you will be working it into the back body and not into the sleeve. So I just find it a little easier doing it that way instead of me explaining both methods to you. But I will still explain both methods to you. Method 1 will be exactly as I had worked for my actual sweater, and then I'll cut into the video to show you method 2. I prefer that you use method 1. As I said, you can always measure out your armhole depth, and then if you find that for your next round you will not be working into the back body, you can go ahead and work one more round for your yoke. That way, for the next round, you will be working it into your back body, and then you can continue on with method 1 for round 1 of the body. Method 1 is my preference, but as I said, I'll show you both ways. Now we'll continue on from where we've stopped for the body. Round 1 of the body, turn into that chain 2 space, work a sedge stitch. So it's a single crochet, a half double crochet, and a double crochet. Then you'll continue on with your stitch pattern, skipping 2 stitches, and then it's your sedge stitch into the 3rd stitch. You'll continue on to that stitch marker on the opposite side right here. I've worked my way from the start here along the back to my stitch marker right here. Into that chain 2 space, I'll work a sedge stitch. Then it's chain 3. 1, 2, 3. This chain, what it does is it loosens up on the sleeve and on the body. After you've chained 3, you'll skip the stitches in between from one stitch marker to the next. So these are the stitches that make up the sleeve portion of the raglan. You'll skip those stitches and work a sedge stitch into that chain 2 space at the next corner. We formed the first armhole space. Continue on with the sedge stitch pattern to your next stitch marker. I've worked my way from that armhole space all along the front to my next stitch marker. So right here into that chain 2 space, I'll work a sedge stitch. Then it's chain 3, 1, 2, 3. I'll skip the stitches in between from my stitch marker to that starting point right here. These stitches make up my second armhole space, and I will slip stitch into that single crochet to join. Here I formed my second armhole space. I'll show you method 2 if you have stopped, as I have done for this mini sample. So here, round 1 of the body, chain 1 and turn. You will see that my stitches flow into the sleeve portion of this yoke. So I'm going to work a sedge stitch into that chain 2 space. And then I'll chain 3, 1, 2, 3, skip the stitches in between. This forms the sleeve. Those are the stitches that I'm skipping, and then I'll work a sedge stitch into that next corner. So here I formed the first armhole space. Then I'll continue on working my sedge stitch pattern into those single crochets from the round before. That way I'll be skipping the 2 stitches in between until I get to my next stitch marker. I'll work sedge stitches all the way across. When I get to my next stitch marker, I'll work a sedge stitch into that chain 2 space, and then I'll need to chain 3 and skip the stitches in between and work a sedge stitch into this chain 2 space to join, thereby forming my next armhole space. Once I've joined at this corner, I'll work sedge stitches all the way. I'll work my last sedge stitch into that single crochet from the stitch before my start, and then I'll slip stitch into the single crochet from this sedge stitch at start to join. Then for my next round, it's chain 1, turn, and I'll continue on with my stitch pattern all the way around, skipping 2 stitches and working those sedge stitches into the single crochets. When you get to chains under the armhole spaces, you'll work them. You follow your stitch pattern just as it is, skipping 2 stitches, working your sedge stitch into the single crochets, and as you get to that chain, you'll work your sedge stitch into the single crochet from this stitch pattern from the previous round, and then you'll skip 2 chains, work a sedge stitch into the 3rd chain, then you can continue on skipping your 2 stitches, working your sedge stitch into the single crochets from the round before. So you will at all times follow your stitch pattern. That's skipping 2 stitches and then it's your sedge stitch. The same applies to your chains. If you've worked a sedge stitch into your last stitch before the chain, then you'll skip 2 chains and you'll work a sedge stitch into the 3rd chain. That way you get to skip 2 stitches after and continue on with your sedge stitch pattern. Keep that in mind when working stitches into your chains. Remember to always skip 2 stitches, in this case 2 chains, and then work your sedge stitch. Okay, so that was method 2 explained. I'll now continue on with my tutorial. Once you've worked your stitch pattern for round 2, it's exactly the same as it is for round 3 from my tutorial. So you'll follow round 3 and continue on. Round 2 of the body, chain 1, turn into that same stitch from where we've slip stitched and chained 1, work a sedge stitch, skip 2 chains, into the 3rd chain, work a sedge stitch, then you continue on with your sedge stitch pattern, skipping 2 stitches, and into the 3rd stitch, work a sedge stitch. Continue on until you get to the armhole space on the opposite side. I've worked my way from that first chain under the armhole all the way along here, and here I am at the 2nd chain under the armhole. So I'll continue working those sedge stitch pattern right to that chain. Here's my chain 3. I'll skip 2 chains, 1, 2. Into the 3rd chain, I'll work a sedge stitch. And then I'll continue on with my stitch pattern, skipping 2 stitches and working my sedge stitch into the 3rd stitch. Continue on to the end of the round. When you get to the end, slip stitch into the single crochet at the start. I've completed round 2 of the body. I slip stitched into the single crochet right at the start. Round 3, it's chain 1 and turn. Work a sedge stitch into that same stitch from where the chain 1 comes out of. Continue on with your stitch pattern, skipping 2 stitches and working your sedge stitch into the third stitch. Here you're working in the round, you work the way all around until you get back to the start. Right here, you can slip stitch into that single crochet to join. I've continued on with the body of this sweater. So this was the underarm that I had just worked. And then I repeated round 3 until I got to the length, my required length for the sweater. Once you get to the required length, we'll work the ribbings at the bottom of the sweater. So it's chain 1, and if you're on the wrong side, you'll turn. We'll work a round of single crochets along this bottom edge. I find that my bottom edge is really loose at the bottom. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to skip my half double crochets. If you find that you want a looser fit on your ribbing or at the bottom, you will go ahead and work stitches throughout into all stitches. In my case, I'll be skipping the half double crochets. So that's the center stitch on my stitch pattern. Single crochet into all stitches or skip the center stitch. So it's those half double crochets. By skipping that center stitch, you tighten up even more on the bottom of your sweater. So when you get to your ribbing, it helps tighten up on that ribbing even more. So you continue on with single crochets along this bottom edge. I've worked those single crochets along this bottom edge. Here I am at the end. I'll slip stitch into that first single crochet. Make certain that you are working with your smaller hook for the ribbing. For the ribbing, you'll chain 11. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. Now, for children's sizes, you can go shorter on this length of chains. You can go make it 9 or 7, all depending. The number of chains that you use is really up to you on how wide you'd like your ribbing. I generally use 11 for adults and 9 for children. Into the second chain from the hook, single crochet. Continue with single crochets into the remaining chains. I've worked my way to the end of round 1. Make certain that your stitch count remains the same. If you've worked 11 chains, you should have 10 stitches. So that's 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. Now we need to join this portion of the ribbing to the bottom edge of our sweater. To do that, we'll slip stitch into these stitches. Work 2 slip stitches along this bottom edge. So that's 1 and 2. Then turn, round 2. Always skip your slip stitches, so it's this one stitch and the second stitch, and then into that next stitch, work single crochets, work all your single crochets into the back loops only to complete this round. I've worked my way to the end of round 2, round 3, chain 1 and turn. Here we're working single crochets into all stitches. We'll work those single crochets into the back loops only. Our first stitch is the stitch from where that chain 1 comes out of. Continue on to complete this round. I've worked my way to the end of round 3. For the rest of the ribbing, we'll repeat rounds 2 and rounds 3. To complete round 3, we need to join this edge of the ribbing to the bottom edge of our sweater. Work 2 slip stitches. That's 1 and 2. And then turn. Round 4. Skip those slip stitches and into the next stitch work single crochets. Work your single crochets into the back loops only. Continue on repeating round 2 and round 3 until you've worked your way all along this bottom edge of the sweater. I've continued on with the ribbing, working my way all around that bottom edge. At this point, I've used up all my stitches and my ribbing, the ends are able to meet. We'll now slip stitch to join these 2 ends of the ribbing. So it's a chain 1, and here we're working into, I choose to work into that back loop on the one side and then into the stitch on the opposite side of the ribbing. And then you'll yarn over and pull through all those loops on your hook. For the next stitch, continue on slip stitching to join the edges. You can then fasten off and cut off on the excess. We'll now work the sleeve. When working the sleeve, you need to begin into a single crochet from the sedge stitch in the round before. Closest to your underarm, find a sedge stitch, the single crochet. You'll work into a single crochet from a sedge stitch. So here's my stitch. It's a double crochet, half double crochet, and a single crochet. So that's where I'll start off here, right here. You can orientate yourself. Attach yarn to that stitch. Chain 1, and here you'll work a sedge stitch into that same stitch from where the chain 1 comes out of. So it's a single crochet, half double crochet, and a double crochet all into that same stitch. And then you'll continue on with your stitch pattern, skipping 2 stitches, working your sedge stitch. Now here you'll find that especially when you're working under the arm, there are no stitches to work into. Keep your sedge stitches evenly spaced throughout. Work them into the little gaps that you see along the way, and space them in such a way that when you get to your sedge stitch that's recognizable on the opposite side, like you see here on the side, and you can recognize that it is a sedge stitch. Like here, if you look at it, there are no stitches to work into here, right here. So when you get to something that's recognizable as a sedge stitch, here it is, work your next sedge stitch into the single crochet right here, and then you can continue on with your stitch pattern. It's only for the first round of the sleeve that you will have an issue with the underarm. You just need to work your sedge stitches, keeping them more or less evenly spaced, and you'll work them into the little gaps along the way. So here's a little gap. I'll work a sedge stitch right there. And then here's another little gap. I'll work a sedge stitch. Here's a gap. I'll work a sedge stitch. Oops. And then here I am into that. I can clearly see the sedge stitch. Here's the single crochet. I'll work a sedge stitch into that single crochet. And from here on, I can continue on with my pattern, skipping 2 stitches, working my sedge stitches into those single crochets from the round before. So here goes. This is the underarm. And here you'll see in the next round it's a lot clearer because we've got all these stitches to work into. Continue on with your sedge stitch pattern to the end of the round. I've worked my way to the end of round 1 for the sleeve. I've got 2 stitches to go. I'll skip those 2 stitches, and into the single crochet from my first sedge stitch, I can slip stitch to join. Round 2, chain 1 and turn. Into that same stitch from where the chain 1 comes out of, work a sedge stitch. So that's your single crochet, half double crochet, and a double crochet all into that 1 stitch. And then again, you're repeating the pattern. You'll skip 2 stitches, a sedge stitch into the single crochet from the round before, and you'll continue on all the way to the end of the round. When you get to the end, slip stitch into the single crochet. That is the stitch pattern for the sleeve. You'll repeat the sleeve to your required length, leaving 3 inches, 2.5 to 3 inches for your sleeve ribbings. I've continued on with the sleeve. I've repeated round 2 until I got to the length for my sleeve. I then worked a ribbing just as I had done when I worked the ribbing at the bottom of the sweater. I worked single crochets along that edge of my sleeve. I skipped the stitch in between, so I skipped the half double crochets, and then I worked a chain of 11, and I worked my ribbing just as I had done for the ribbing at the bottom of the sweater. Here you'll see that my sleeve is rather wide, so I chose to go even tighter with my ribbing. I worked 3 slip stitches instead of 2 for the ribbings at my sleeve, and that made the ribbing even tighter here. You can work 2 slip stitches, or you can work 3 slip stitches. Working 3 slip stitches, as I said, just tightens up even more on that ribbing. You can then fasten off and cut off on the excess yarn. Now you'll repeat the same step for your other sleeve, and then once you're done, all that's left to do is to weave in all these ends. So you weave all your ends into the wrong side. Here you're going back and forth into your stitches. Cut off on the excess. And that does it for this tutorial. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.